We've all been there. You just started homebrewing, and now you're trying to figure out just how boozy that homebrew is. Well, fortunately, we've got some tools to help us figure that out. This is the hydrometer. We have a few different hydrometer options we're going to show you today, as well as explain the hydrometer and how it works. This is potentially the most important tool in homebrewing because the hydrometer helps you track the progress of fermentation so you know when it's started and when it's finished, and it helps you figure out what alcohol by volume your homebrew is. This tool tells you if you've got a 4% beer or a 12% beer, an 8% mead or an 18% mead. If there's one tool you're going to invest in for your homebrewing journey, this is the tool. But what does a hydrometer do? Well, it measures the density of liquid. Yeast turn sugar into alcohol. That's how we make homebrew. We add yeast and they convert the sugars into alcohol and carbon dioxide. Sugar in a suspension of liquid is more dense than alcohol. So if you've got a sugary liquid, your hydrometer will float higher than if you've got a liquid full of ethanol, alcohol, which causes the hydrometer to float lower. Ethanol is less dense than sugar. It's a fairly simple concept, but knowing how much sugar is in your brew and how much sugar is left in your brew when the fermentation is done helps you calculate your alcohol by volume. If you have a number at the beginning of fermentation and a number once fermentation has ended, you can use the difference between those two numbers to know how much alcohol is in your brew. And like I said, it also helps you track fermentation. Using a hydrometer throughout fermentation allows you to know where your fermentation is at. I don't check mine often, but when I notice my fermentation has started to slow down, I'll use the hydrometer to check my gravity and see if it has stabilized out to a consistent number. We'll talk about that in a minute. So I've been throwing around this term gravity and specific gravity. Let's explain what specific gravity is. Gravity is the measure of the density of liquid. That's really it. Some people will go by gravity, other people will go by Brix, which is specifically the sugar concentration of a liquid, usually juice. A hydrometer is usually calibrated by temperature, usually somewhere around room temperature. And when you put it into the liquid, these numbers here correlate to that specific gravity. So if it's at 1.100, that is measuring a very high density of specific gravity. But if it was at 1.030, that's a relatively low specific gravity. And then we take that term, specific gravity, and we apply it in other ways. There is your original gravity or starting gravity, and that's the gravity at the beginning of fermentation. Then there is your final gravity, which is your gravity at the end of fermentation. So you can run a calculation of your starting gravity or original gravity minus your final gravity, and then you multiply it by 131.25. That will give you a general estimate of the alcohol by volume in your brew. Now, don't be confused. There are a lot of hydrometers out there on the market. This is ours. It is a polycarbonate hydrometer, and we'll talk about some of the others in a minute. However, we should briefly talk about an alcohol hydrometer or a distiller's hydrometer, which is a different but similar tool. Generally, they're colored yellow, so you can tell the difference between the two. Not always, but generally. And this is to measure the alcohol in a spirit, like vodka or whiskey. And so it is calibrated differently from a homebrewing hydrometer. So if you're looking for a hydrometer, definitely go to CraftaBrew.com to pick up your hydrometer. But make sure you don't accidentally get one of these because this is not effective for homebrew. Since this is looking for the specific gravity of the concentration of alcohol in water, it can't measure the same densities that this one does, at least not how it's marked. So generally, what you're looking for when you buy a homebrewing hydrometer is a triple scale hydrometer, and that's what we sell here at CraftaBrew. It is also very important to note that the markings on here that give you an estimated alcohol percentage are not measuring the percentage of alcohol in your homebrew. Some people look at that and say, oh, I measured it at 10%, so it's 10% alcohol. Those markings are specific to an estimate at the start of fermentation. So, for example, if you've mixed up your brew to 1.078, that marking there tells you that it could be around 10% alcohol if it ferments all the way to dry. A lot of times your brews are not going to ferment all the way to dry, or you might do something else to the brew in primary or secondary that changes that number. And so you really need to have your starting gravity and your final gravity before anything else has been mixed in or messed with so you can know your alcohol by volume accurately. So to be clear, you want to test it right when you've mixed everything up and it's ready for you to pitch your yeast, and you want to test it again after fermentation has completed, but before you've added anything else like lactose or maltodextrin or fruit sugars or anything else that might change that gravity number. So, as fermentation goes along, sugars turn into alcohol and your liquid becomes less dense, allowing the hydrometer to do its measurements. Like I said, you can run that calculation, but the big brain move is to use a tool like meadtools.com's alcohol by volume calculator, because the algorithm behind this calculator uses a quadratic formula to give you a more precise alcohol estimate than just running the starting gravity minus final gravity times 131.25 formula. It is a much more accurate calculator. There are a lot of ABV by gravity calculators out there, but in my experience, the one at meadtools.com is the most exact, particularly because if you're making a very high alcohol brew, that formula changes just a little bit, and meadtools.com's ABV calculator has those variables built in. Of course, there is the polycarbonate triple scale hydrometer. You can't really break it, and it's one of my favorite tools. There are also glass hydrometers available. Similar to this distiller's hydrometer, they are made of incredibly fragile glass. And if I were to bang this one on the table, like I did with the polycarbonate one, it would shatter immediately. So back in the day, we used to say, if you're going to buy a hydrometer, buy two. So that way you always have a backup. I love the polycarbonate hydrometer. And if you're using a hydrometer like this one, you're going to need a graduated cylinder. It is the easiest way of measuring your liquid because you can fill it up with a minimum amount of liquid to test and float your hydrometer in it. Works a lot better than trying to throw a hydrometer in a bucket or a carboy. To get your liquid in, you're going to want to use one of these or a wine thief. These are turkey basters. This one was like $2 at the local grocery store. And basically you pull your sample with the turkey baster and you run it down the side of the graduated cylinder to minimize oxygen exposure, get your sample, and then return your sample to the carboy or bucket very gently, again, to minimize oxygen exposure. This is also one of the best tools to have in your brew room. I know, kind of crazy. Like I said, you could also get a wine thief. It is a tool specifically made for pulling samples, but it's not necessary, especially if you're brewing at the 1-gallon level. A turkey baster works just fine. Other options for hydrometers include this beast. This is a DIY project called iSpindle, and as you can see, it's enormous. And so it really only works well in buckets. But if you're a DIYer, you like to solder and kind of roll your own, this can be a fun option if you can find the parts. Or there is the Tilt Mini Pro. We sell the Tilt Mini Pro at CraftaBrew. It's a little bit on the spendier side, but it is a no muss, no fuss solution. You don't have to be taking samples. You don't have to be pouring and returning and measuring. This thing does it all digitally, and it sends that information to your phone, so you never even have to open up your carboy or bucket. If you're really into homebrewing and this is a long-term hobby for you, the Tilt is a great investment. Now that we've talked all about it, I want to make sure you have a visual representation of how to use a hydrometer. So let's find ourselves a mead or a wine and take a sample. All right, here's a good one. This is a mead that is in the progress of fermenting, but it looks like it might be done. We notice that there are not really many, if any, bubbles coming up to the airlock. We don't really see any bubbles on the side here coming up to the top, just a little bit of bubbles ringing the top. And there's a lot of sediment here at the bottom. You can see that a lot of stuff has begun settling out, meaning that the yeast are less active. A lot of the yeast are dropping out of suspension, as well as solids from the honey are dropping out. So it's a good time to check on this mead and see if it has finished fermenting. We have the original reading for the gravity that was 1.082. So we're going to see where we are now with this potentially finished mead. So all we do is remove the airlock, and then I will go sanitize our turkey baster and our hydrometer and graduated cylinder. Be right back. Alrighty, with everything sanitized, we can take our sample. I like to put my hydrometer in first, and then start pulling my sample, and it's going to take 3 or 4 passes with the baster to get enough liquid to do the sample. Just gently pour down the side, so that way you're minimizing how much air gets into your mead. And then we can see where it floats to. And we can see here that that is at 1.000 exactly. So if we plug those variables in at meadtools.com or any other reputable ABV calculator, or if we run the math ourselves, we can see that it is at 10.82% alcohol by volume. That is a nice hearty mead. So we just remove our hydrometer, and then very gently we return it to the carboy. Now, in the old days, people would just dump these out because they were worried about infection. They were worried about something nasty getting into their mead from doing this process. But what we've learned over the years is that as long as you're really careful about sanitizing everything, you can very gently return your sample to the carboy. No problem, no worries. So we've learned a few things here. We learned the final gravity of our mead. It's 1.000, which means all the sugars are gone and it is a completely dry mead. We learned our alcohol by volume by taking the starting gravity and final gravity, running that calculation to get the number of 10.82% ABV. And we know that our mead is finished fermenting. We know it primarily because the gravity has dropped to kind of a flat line. It could go slightly lower. And to confirm that it's done fermenting, I will check on this again in 2 days, and then 2 days after that. And if that gravity has stayed at 1.000, I know that this mead is finished fermenting. A few things to note: if you're using a polycarbonate hydrometer, you can drop it right into the cylinder. That's no problem. However, if you're using a glass hydrometer, you will want to very delicately place it in the bottom of your graduated cylinder, so that way you don't accidentally shatter it. When you're checking your gravity, you want to make sure that the hydrometer is floating in the middle of the graduated cylinder and that it is not resting on the bottom. No matter what, it should be floating in your liquid. If it gets stuck on the side, or if there are carbon dioxide bubbles lifting it up, you may need to swirl slightly or just let your sample sit for a couple minutes. Carbon dioxide bubbles can artificially lift your hydrometer up and change the reading. So you want to make sure that there's not too much gas in there altering that reading at the end. And that's partly why we check it multiple times to verify that fermentation has actually completed. This set is a really great set. And if you don't have a hydrometer, this is the one to get. Another great use of the hydrometer is to monitor for stalled fermentation. That is a fermentation that has stopped too early or earlier than you expected. And we have a whole video on stalled fermentation, so check that out if you think you have that problem. But if you're noticing that your fermentation seems to have stopped early and you check it with the hydrometer and you can verify that there's still way too much sugar in there, the yeast should still be able to continue cutting through that sugar, then you have used your hydrometer to identify a stalled fermentation. And again, we've got ways to fix that. Have you just started homebrewing? What hydrometer do you have? Let us know in the comments. And if you've been brewing for a long time and have experience with a lot of these, also drop a comment and let us know what your experience has been like using a polycarbonate, a glass, or an electronic hydrometer. And of course, if you love content like this, or if you really want to excel in your homebrewing journey, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring that notification bell so you don't miss any of the upcoming content here at CraftaBrew. I'm BC for CraftaBrew, and until next time, I hope you've got good things brewing.